Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Polis Project Digital Book Salon. My name is Michael Busch, and I am the Director of Public Programs here at Polis. Today, we are pleased to be joined by Dr. Daniel Royles, Assistant Professor of History at Florida International University, and the author of To Make the Wounded Whole, The African American Struggle Against HIV and AIDS, recently published by the University of North Carolina Press, which is the book that we're going to be discussing today. Before we begin, just a brief note to our audience that, as usual, part of the goal here is to simulate an actual book event, which means that to the extent possible, we'll try to make this an interactive event with you, the audience. So if you've got a question for our guest, please send it along via Twitter by typing in @project_polis. Or if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, you can type your question into the comments box. And if there's time permitting, we will ask it. But without further ado, let's get started. Dan Royles, welcome to the Polis Project Digital Book Salon.
Thanks for having me, Michael. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. So, I thought we could begin by having you talk about how this book came to be. Can you talk a little bit about the origins of the book and how you came to write To Make the Wounded Whole?
Yeah, the book started way back in 2009. I was in grad school at Temple University in Philadelphia. And as you do in grad school, I had a research seminar and I had to write a research seminar paper. And I decided that I wanted to write about AIDS activism in Philadelphia. And I had a kind of vague idea of what that might look like in my head. And when I got into the archive, I found the story of Rashida Hassan and Babashi. Rashida Hassan was a Black Muslim nurse in Philadelphia in the 80s. She's still there today. And she started an organization called Blacks Educating Blacks About Sexual Health Issues, or Babashi. And I found this story really interesting for a number of reasons, I think some of which we'll get into. One of the things that really grabbed me was that in a way that I didn't realize going into this research, she exploded my mental picture about what an AIDS activist looks like. The subconscious image that I had in my head was very ACT UP in the early 90s, combat boots, jeans, leather jackets, silence equals death t-shirt, all of that. And here's a Black Muslim nurse who, wears a headscarf and, is doing this work even earlier in Philadelphia to address the Black AIDS epidemic there. And so I found that story really, really interesting, and also, was aware that it wasn't the kind of story that had kind of filtered into our larger narratives about AIDS and AIDS activism in the United States. And so I wanted to kind of pull on that thread and find more stories. And once I did, I found more stories, and those are the stories that ended up being the chapters of my dissertation, which is now my book, To Make the Wounded Whole.
Fantastic. And before we jump into the substantive history of the book that you relate, I was hoping that you could speak a little bit about the title, To Make the Wounded Whole, which comes from a Black spiritual, the Balm in Gilead. And you argue that this imagery of making the wounded whole plays out in multiple ways in the history and takes on different meanings in the narrative that you relate throughout the course of the book. Can you talk about how that's so?
Yeah, I argue that it plays out really in two key ways. In the Black AIDS activists work to make the wounded whole, both in terms of the place of queerness within prevailing ideas about Blackness, and then in terms of the way that African Americans relate to people in the rest of the African diaspora. So taking the first of those, I use a definition of queerness that borrows from the work of Kathy Cohen, who was a political scientist, and that she developed in a classic essay called Possible Daughters and Welfare Queens. It's about the kind of lost opportunity for queer organizing. If we look at queerness as more of less about kind of being an umbrella term for gay sexuality or for same-sex desire, and more for the collection of identities and lived experiences that are disavowed by normative politics. So, here thinking about in the context of the book, not only gay and bisexual men, but intravenous drug users, people transitioning, formerly incarcerated people, women in housing, a whole collection of people who are disproportionately affected by HIV and AIDS, but who historically have had a difficult time, finding an entree into normative politics. At the time that a lot of the work that I describe in the book was going on, Black gay men in particular are coming up against a set of ideas that are, promulgated under the aegis of cultural nationalism or of Afrocentric thought that say that same-sex desire is either a European corruption or a tool of oppression, or both. And so they are making the argument that Black gay men and same-sex desire have a place in Black communities and have had a place in Black communities throughout history. So that's one kind of, making the wounded whole around issues of queerness in Black communities and Black identity. And then the other piece of that is kind of playing on Saidiya Hartman's idea of the transatlantic slave trade as a wound. And here I look at how African-American AIDS activists are working with ideas about diaspora and working with people throughout the diaspora. So they're forging connections with their counterparts in the Caribbean and in Africa, as well as kind of designing or investing in treatment and prevention programs within the United States, within US Black communities that play on ideas about, Africanness and African identity as something that can be, a locus of identification and energy for people to, do that kind of work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as you mentioned, sort of in your opening remarks, your history of African-American AIDS activism begins in Philadelphia, as you tell it, and focuses on the work of Blacks educating Blacks about sexual health issues, one of the first Black AIDS organizations in the United States, otherwise known as Babashi. Can you talk about Babashi's approach to organizing and how it sheds light not just on racial tensions within the gay community, but also the challenges that homophobia within Black communities presented to activists during the early years of the AIDS crisis?
Yeah. Babashi is an interesting story for a couple of reasons. One of those is that it's one of the first Black AIDS service organizations in the country, and that makes it, in some ways exceptional. But it's also in some ways a very typical story, as I came to learn in the course of research, because Babashi emerged out of and in kind of opposition to or in response to the predominantly white gay organizations that were the first line of response to AIDS in Philadelphia. So these are the groups that sprung up, in 1981, 2, 3, to respond to, the emerging crisis of AIDS in Philadelphia, which at the time was seen by many people, Black and white, as a white gay disease, in ways that are kind of explicit and implicit. So very quickly it became clear that AIDS was a disease that was also impacting the Black community at large disproportionately, and specifically Black gay men. But these organizations were doing a poor job of adjusting and reaching out to Black gay men in particular and Black communities more generally. And so Rashida Hassan started working within these organizations along with a number of other activists. And by 1985-86 had become very frustrated and split off to start Babashi. And the explicit argument that Rashida and others made was that, in order to reach the people that needed to be reached, including Black gay men, they had to canvass the whole Black community. And what they're, again, explicitly saying is that Black gay men are Black first and gay second, because of the segregated nature of, gay life in Philadelphia, and also just the segregated nature of Philadelphia as an urban space. So, in order to reach Black gay men, as well as women who are at risk, intravenous drug users who are at risk, they argue that they have to, as she says, do the whole community. That's an interesting argument to make, and it's one that kind of contravened what Black gay activists at the same time were saying about that relationship between Blackness and gayness. This is at the same time that groups like the National Coalition of Black Lesbians and Gays is saying, we are as proud of our gayness as we are of our Blackness. So there's a way that different groups, Babashi is one of those that I look at, navigate this question of that relationship between Blackness and gayness differently. On the question of Black homophobia, that's a way that the epidemic gets talked about and explained quite a bit. Is that this is like a function of Black homophobia, which certainly exists in the community, but I argue, and others have argued, that homophobia exists in Black communities in the way that homophobia exists in American society, and that it may take kind of different shapes or forms in specific communities, but we're talking about a societal issue. And I think to kind of hone in on that is like, well, homophobia is a Black problem. Well, no, homophobia is an American problem. Homophobia is a global problem. When we isolate that within communities that are already minoritized or marginalized, I think we end up reproducing that marginalization, that minoritization, by making it out to be a specific pathology of those communities, when it's really not. It's not to say that it doesn't exist there, but that's because it exists. It's systemic, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, I want to also turn to the work of the National Task Force on AIDS Prevention, which you also discuss in your book. And I wanted to have you talk about how the task force's approach to activism differed from Babashi's, and what this teaches us about the inherent power of grassroots coalition at the grassroots organizing level.
Yeah. The National Task Force has a kind of different impulse to its politics, kind of out of necessity, because it starts in a different way. So the National Task Force grows out of an organization called Black and White Men Together, which is an interracial gay men's group that started 1980-81. And they got some major funding from CDC in the late 80s to start the National Task Force on AIDS Prevention. And so the National Task Force worked kind of at two levels. They worked at the national level, designing programs that would bring messages about HIV prevention to Black gay men, but also at the local level around their office or their headquarters in San Francisco, where they really kind of intentionally worked to build coalitional institutions or coalitional institutional structures that would bring together not only Black gay men, but Asian American, Hispanic, and Native American gay men's groups, as we could share resources and information, as well as not compete with each other for funding. But kind of the result of that is that the National Task Force, even as they're working in ways that are really targeted to Black men and designing programs that are for Black gay men, they're also developing a kind of analysis around the category of gay men of color as a category that they find to be politically useful in mobilizing that coalition, but also kind of making broader claims about the kinds of resources that need to become available nationally. So that's different from what Babashi is doing, where Babashi is really foregrounding race in how they're talking about Black gay men. The National Task Force is developing a kind of more synthetic or holistic idea of Black gay identity, but also one that kind of fits within this larger category of gay men of color, which again, this two groups don't represent like the whole terrain of how people navigate this question. But they, I think, give us two important examples to look at. And I also want to be clear, like, I use these groups as kind of counterexamples to each other in the book, but their founders were actually really good friends. Rashida and Reggie Williams, who is the executive of the National Task Force, were close friends because they worked together in this larger national space, trying to do much of the same work. Rashida actually showed me a really lovely letter that Reggie wrote to her kind of near the end of his life, just talking about how much he valued, her work and her as a friend, that really for me kind of made clear that the folks that I wrote about are working in this larger context of, a national network or, this wider world of Black AIDS activism, and are very much in conversation with one another.
Yeah, I also wanted just to push a little bit further on the National Task Force. One of the things that also comes up in the book is the fact that they were federally funded, and that sort of created a whole world or ecosystem of politics. Can you talk a little bit about that piece of things, about what federal funding sort of did and created around the work of the group, and sort of maybe with a view to sort of foreshadowing how those politics continue to play out into the future?
Yeah. I mean, it's true of both of them, because actually Babashi and the National Task Force, like they got major federal funding from the same grant program, like in the same year, which probably helps to explain how Reggie and Rashida became friends. But it introduces a couple of complicating factors, right? On the one hand, the groups need money. They're seeing a major problem, a really major problem, and need money in order to do that, and the government is the best resourced funder in order to help them do that. At the same time, the amount of money they get is never going to be enough to actually address the problem, but that money comes with some complications. One is that very often you're talking about grassroots groups, Babashi, the National Task Force, like they're new groups, and they're staffed by people who are experienced at delivering care, delivering prevention. But there's a lot more that goes into managing a federal grant that totals, several $100,000. And that in itself is quite a lot of work. The groups are not, often don't have the resources to handle. And so, that became very complicated for a group like Babashi that ended up going bankrupt, in part because, they just didn't have the specific expertise to manage that grant. For the National Task Force, it became a huge liability because some of their sex positive programs drew a lot of negative attention from conservatives in Congress and conservative movement. And so, they ended up having their funding reduced quite a bit in the middle of the 5-year grant period, which when you're running a major, a community nonprofit organization, to have your funding withdrawn, with little warning, to say that like complicates your work is putting it really, really mildly. So, that federal funding comes also with new levels of scrutiny and oversight, that can really be kind of punitive in their effects. And, I don't accident that, it's these groups like Babashi or National Task Force, that are on the one hand, both are Black identified, and one is gay identified, and that they drew kind of specific scrutiny for the work that they were doing.
Yeah. Your study also examines the part that played by the Nation of Islam in the fight against AIDS, which seems, as you tell it, to be a pretty mixed bag. Can you discuss the complicated role that they play in this history, but also what it shows us about the political economy of AIDS treatments during the 1990s?
Yeah. I didn't expect to write about the Nation of Islam when I started this project. I'll just say that at the outset. But I came to their story in the process of writing about the prevalence of conspiracy theories and the role of conspiracy theories in, the work that African-American AIDS activists did, just like in the larger context of AIDS and Black communities. And the Nation of Islam comes into the story because in the late 1980s, there's a scientist in Kenya named Davy Koech who announced that he had discovered a treatment for AIDS that was non-toxic and cheap and specifically African. And he made some pretty wild claims about what his drug could do. And so he's pretty kind of roundly ignored by the American and European press. The story gets picked up by the Black American press, who see this as an example of the white media underplaying the achievements of a Black scientist, which is very much what it appears to be, kind of on its face. Within a few years, the Nation of Islam comes into the story because they send people to go to Kenya to get treated, to investigate this treatment, and they get the rights for distribution within the United States from this Kenyan lab to distribute this drug called Kemron. And the way the Nation of Islam kind of sells this is as, again, a non-toxic, cheap, and specifically Black treatment for AIDS. And so one that's going to be really good for, Black communities in the United States. And this comes along with kind of a lot of the baggage that the Nation of Islam brings in terms of, its narrative about, and the Nation of Islam origin story is actually about, it is rooted in a story about like science and the creation of these two races. But they send people around the country basically pitching this drug to Black communities, trying to drum up support for a federally funded or federally supported clinical trial for Kemron, and they end up getting it. They end up getting it right about the time that highly effective treatments actually become available, and so it becomes a little bit of a moot point. But I think one of the reasons that their pitch lands so well is that at the time that Kemron is developed, or the time that Kemron is announced, I should say, there's one drug that's approved by the FDA to treat AIDS. It's AZT. It's very expensive, and it's highly toxic. So, the story that Davy Koech and the Nation of Islam are telling is a really attractive story. And for Black communities in particular, very attractive because of where the drug is supposed to come from. It's supposed to come from Africa. It's supposed to come from African scientists, who, it's at least suggested, have kind of, have the well-being of Black people at heart. So that story kind of flattens what's a more complex story about where Kemron comes from. It's kind of on the cutting edge of, scientific medical advancement. And it also has these links to the kind of globalized supply chain of pharmaceuticals. But in Koech's telling and the Nation of Islam's telling, it's like this, natural, holistic, African, cheap, remedy for AIDS.
Yeah. Sort of drawing on this a little bit and actually sort of also looking backwards to your discussion of Babashi, there's this subplot in the book, I think, that builds slowly and then really begins to take hold in later chapters, which looks at the internationalization of African-American AIDS activism. The Kemron endeavor is one example. You also talked about in the book about how Babashi had sort of some early endeavors within the international space as well. And then you also highlight groups like the Balm of Gilead, which drew connections between the AIDS crisis and Black America and the growing epidemic across Africa. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of the Balm of Gilead's approach domestically, and also how was their work and the work of other international-minded groups received by Africans themselves?
Yeah, the Balm of Gilead is a group that starts in the late 80s as the Harlem Week of Prayer for the Healing of AIDS. And it's a group that works with Black faith communities to deliver messages about HIV education and prevention, for example, in Black churches. So, this is really trying to leverage the historic power of the Black church to address this new crisis. So they build over the course of, the early 90s, and by the middle 90s are really pushing to kind of expand the work that they've done within the United States, with Black churches in the United States to, the African diasporic world, so Africa and the Caribbean. And their founder, Pernessa Seal, makes this very explicit argument that Black people do Black church all over the world, are her words. And so there's this idea that, the programs they developed in the United States will work in Black communities throughout the world because there is something essential about the Black religious experience, no matter where people are. And so they are able to kind of play on the growing emphasis on addressing global AIDS, quote unquote global AIDS, which really means, addressing AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa, in order to, get foundation funding, to get federal funding, to develop programs in a number of sub-Saharan African countries. And they end up doing so. They, up to today, have a second headquarters in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. The reality on the ground, I think, is a little bit more complex. Many of the partnerships that they forged through that project, ended up not continuing. The one in Tanzania did, but others did not. And I think it speaks to, the way in which the idea about, what it means to have diasporic identity, there's sometimes a gap between the idea of diasporic identity and the kind of practice. Africans themselves don't always have the same kind of ideas about that essential kind of Blackness that others do. So it's an interesting kind of example of, one example in a longer history of African American engagement with ideas about diaspora that, really go back well over a century, where, the idea of an essential sameness doesn't always play out in reality.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from the audience, kind of going back for a moment to the Nation of Islam, and you had mentioned earlier how Babashi and the National Task Force, were close in some ways. And the question has to do, how was the Nation of Islam received by other African American AIDS activists and organizations?
Differently. Different groups, depending on kind of their orientation, engage with the Nation of Islam differently. You have to remember, we're talking about the early 90s. This is probably a point of, one of the kind of peaks of the Nation of Islam's political power for thinking about the years leading up to the Million Man March in 1995. So just around the Qumran issue, for example, when the Nation of Islam sends speakers around the country to, promote Qumran as a drug, one of the groups that they work with is Babashi to do one of these sessions in Philadelphia. The written record is, a little bit opaque as to, just how much Rashida and Babashi were invested in this project. But they certainly, worked with them up to a point. And then other groups that are, really specifically oriented to and led by Black gay men, also have to think about how they're going to balance the Nation of Islam's really regressive sexual and gender politics, with their own investments. But the answers that they come to are ones that may surprise at least some of us, because, if their alternative is to work with predominantly white gay organizations, they're really balancing which oppression do I want to interface with? Do I want to do I want to interface with heterosexism or racism? And sometimes they choose heterosexism and choose to work with the Nation of Islam or, kind of its affiliated organizations or actors. But with something like the Million Man March, some of the groups that I read about, like gay men of African descent, decide to have some kind of a presence at the Million Man March, despite its kind of regressive gender and sexual politics, because it's a way of celebrating Blackness and celebrating and growing Black political power. And that's something that they are, in general, invested in. So, there are some unexpected alliances and partnerships that I found in the course of researching the book. And I think, I think the point to take away from those is, for me writing it as a white gay man, who has a different experience than many people that I wrote about, is just understanding the depth of racism that Black gay men in particular, and gay men of color in general, encounter in normatively white gay spaces is really striking. Is really, really striking.
So to sort of move along the course of the narrative, you also tell the story of ACT UP Philadelphia, which remained strong during the mid to late 1990s, even as other ACT UP groups across the country began to wind down. Can you talk a little bit about the battles that they fought during this period that you recount, and how they framed local struggles within the broader context of resistance to neoliberal regimes of free trade and privatized globalization?
Yeah. So ACT UP Philadelphia reinvents itself in the mid-1990s by really deliberately recruiting members and developing power in Philadelphia's poor Black communities, poor Black neighborhoods. So they're really deliberately organizing people who are transitioning out of incarceration, people who are recovering from drug addiction, people who are affected by HIV, but have very little representation in the larger AIDS movement. And the locus of their organizing, or the kind of target of their organizing, is what I write about as capitalist medicine. This is borrowing from Jenny Breyer, who's another historian of AIDS. But organizing against capitalist medicine at the local or state level, in the context of Medicaid privatization in the 1990s, and then against the free trade regimes that prevented, low and middle income countries from getting access to or being able to afford the HIV medications that were just then coming online. So one of the key targets of their organizing is actually Al Gore in his 2000 presidential campaign, because at the time, in the late 90s, Al Gore was chair of the U.S. South Africa Binational Commission. And in that role, put really concerted pressure on South African leaders not to produce or purchase generic HIV drugs, which were much cheaper than their branded counterparts. ACT UP Philadelphia and its allied groups found out about this, and they sent people around as Gore was launching his presidential campaign to, basically, I don't know, in protest politics called bird dogging, but they when he had a campaign event in New Hampshire, they got up on stage with him and dropped a banner that said, "Gore's greed kills, AIDS drugs for Africa." And they won those battles. Clinton announced major changes to U.S. trade policy, that would allow nations like South Africa to get access to the drugs that they needed. Folks in ACT UP Philadelphia and Health Gap, which is one of the groups that they work in and with, also take a lot of credit for the announcement of PEPFAR, which is initially was a $15 billion funding program for AIDS treatment and prevention in the global South that Bush announced in 2003. It's since been renewed at much higher levels. But that's a program that I don't think would have come into being without the grassroots work of groups like Active Philadelphia over years. Their work is, as I read about in the book, a little bit complicated because you have a kind of organizing problem of, a handful of, white HIV negative organizers from middle class backgrounds, organizing poor people of color, poor African Americans in particular. And they're aware of the conflicts, the contradictions, the issues that come along with that. But having talked to a number of people who kind of got a political education, or developed, their political analysis and their grassroots toolkit in that organization, I think was really, really powerful, was really, really impactful. And as I read about in the epilogue of the book, a lot of those folks, they're still organizing. Folks from ACT UP Philadelphia, folks from Health Gap, were really instrumental in protecting the Affordable Care Act in 2017. A lot of the direct action that happened in town halls, targeting Republican Congress people, and then on Capitol Hill in December of 2017, those were organized by people who were like ACT UP veterans. And some of the people that I wrote about in the book, Washida Shabazel, Jose DeMarco, like they were there. They were there sitting in, risking arrest, getting arrested, because it's all part of the same story.
Yeah. Just a follow-up question on that. You were sort of describing, I think, the change in American foreign policy and free trade, politics, from sort of the Reagan years through the Clinton years, and then, the beginning of the Bush administration. Were those changes, or were there changes reflected domestically as well between each of those administrations? In other words, like, did it matter who the president was during these different periods of time, and to what extent within sort of Black communities and Black AIDS activism particularly?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. Yes, it matters. Comparing, for example, the federal funding climate under Reagan versus Clinton versus Bush, like they're very different. And they're different in ways that are not necessarily obvious to kind of outside observers, but for people who are seeking funding as a Black gay organization under Clinton turned out to be pretty different from seeking that same funding under George W. Bush. At the same time that there is a kind of growing emphasis on the fight against global AIDS, there's a de-emphasis on fighting AIDS at home. And it's at the same time that the epidemic is concentrating in poor communities of color. I mean, if you look at the graph of new AIDS cases, it's like there's an inflection point around 96, 97, 98, where the number of new cases, or I forget if it's the raw number, or the proportion of new cases among whites versus African Americans, like they cross. And, after that, it's really predominantly African American. And it's at the same time that the focus is really shifting from home to abroad. So, there's this sense, among some of the activists that I talked to that, Pernessa Seal said really directly, we need a PEPFAR for Black America. Like we didn't get a PEPFAR for Black America. Where was the $15 billion in federal funding to fight the epidemic within our country? It goes back, I think, to some very old ideas about, who deserves help and care, who is deserving of treatment and prevention. And, it's almost always, Black communities, Native communities within the United States who come last, even after, even after Black people in other parts of the world.
Yeah. So you conclude To Make the Wounded Whole by recounting the powerful history of sister love in Atlanta.
Yeah.
By way of discussing the organization's work, can you talk to us about the founder of Sister Love, Dazan Dixon Diallo, and how she built the foundations that had been laid down by the Combahee Collective, Audre Lorde, and even Prince to offer an intersectional analysis of AIDS' impact on Black women, and how that informs Sister Love's response to the AIDS crisis?
Yeah, Sister Love is great. They're an organization that's been active for over 30 years. They're based in Atlanta, and they really focus on HIV and AIDS in Black women, both in the United States and abroad. They work a lot in South Africa now as well. So Dazan Dixon Diallo, came of age in the 1980s when you had these kind of swirling currents of Black feminism in the form of work by Audre Lorde and Barbara Smith, the Kitchen of Table Women of Color Press, like the Combahee River Collective, those kind of currents of Black women asserting that they have a set of interests that is different from both the kind of male-dominated Black power movement and also the investments of white feminism. So Dazan Dixon Diallo is really kind of connected to, specifically within that, the Black women's health movement, and the idea that Black women should be able to control their reproduction, not only in terms of having access to contraceptives and safe abortions, but being able to choose when to have children, because Black women historically have been targeted for sterilization. So that's part of the context for her political education. And as I read about in the book, she's also a huge Prince fan. Like she loves to wear purple. She did her entrance to one of the events at one of the, I think, U.S. Conference on AIDS to Erotic City by Prince. But I use that in the book to kind of, give her a wholeness as a character, as an actor in the story, and to, make her read as a fully fledged person on the page. But it's also important because there is a really strong current of sex positivity that runs from Prince to the work that Sister Love ends up doing. And that is to offer Black women sex positive education about HIV and AIDS that centers Black women's pleasure. And that's something that I think is a thread that runs from, Black feminism through Prince to Dazan, and through the work that she has done with Sister Love and the Black Women's Health Project.
Fantastic. We've got a question from a student at CUNY, and the question is: as a white scholar, can you talk about your approach to engaging with and recounting African American history?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, as a white scholar doing African American history, I've really tried to always approach from a kind of self-critical point of view. I've really tried to ask myself, kind of at every turn with the project, what are the things that I am not seeing? What are the kind of unknowns for me in this project? And so, as a result, have read widely in the field, done lots and lots of obviously primary source archival research to get that kind of range of perspectives, but also done a lot of interviewing. So I have interviewed, I think, over 40 people for the kind of companion African American AIDS activism oral history project. And that is all to better understand, where people are coming from in doing the work that that I, in doing the work that I described, sorry, the dog is wanting attention. But I see it as incumbent upon me as, a historian who comes to the field, with a lot of advantages, just in terms of background, to use those advantages to, highlight and amplify the voices of people who have less of those, and to highlight a history that really has not been represented in our narratives about AIDS and AIDS activism in this country. And one thing that I want to be really clear on is that, like, this is not the book on AIDS activism. This is a book on AIDS activism. There are a lot of other stories to be told, and I hope that through the Oral History Project, I have a digital archiving project as well that goes along with this book. There's some overlap between them, but there's a lot of stories that are captured in those that I was not able to tell in the book. That I'm laying some of the foundation for others to do similar work later on. So I see it as a responsibility to be a good steward of the history, more of a steward than an authority, I guess I would say, is to be the steward of this history and not, the final word, certainly not the own voice on this topic, and to listen as much as I talk, even though I'm talking a lot in this event.
So we're beginning to run a little bit short on time, but I wanted to sort of begin to wrap things up with a question about sort of what's going on today. And I was hoping, I sort of have two questions, I guess, on this front. One is, can you talk about how we can understand the current state of African American AIDS activism right now? In other words, do we see the influence and the lineages of the individuals and the organizations that you profile in the book in the work that's being done today?
Yeah, we see quite a bit of that, actually, in a number of ways. I mean, some of these groups are still active. Babashi is still active in a somewhat different form from what I described in the book. Donna Gilead is still active. Sister Love is still active. Some of the other groups have gone away, but have spun off other groups in their wake. So, the activists who were involved in some of those founded groups, like the National Black Justice Coalition, which organizes around the civil rights of Black LGBTQ people. And then you see kind of more, spiritual heirs of groups like the Gay Men of African Descent, who I also write about, I think has a really strong kind of intellectual or political heir in a group called the Counter Narrative Project, which is also based in Atlanta, but does movement building with Black gay men. And one of the ways that they do movement building with Black gay men is to, teach about and present and share the history, some of the same history that I write about in the book, is the history of Black gay men's organizing and organizing around AIDS and other issues. So, there's a kind of similarity between their work and the work that GMAD did. And they're also using the example of GMAD's work to build power among Black gay men in a way that I think is really, really compelling. I'm a huge fan of the Counter Narrative Project. Another group that we've seen come up in the last couple of years is the Tacoma Action Collective, that organized around the art exhibit Art AIDS America, which debuted at the Tacoma Art Museum in, I think it was 2014 or 2015. But I think 2015. But despite the really devastating, significant disproportionate impact of AIDS on communities of color and specifically Black communities in the United States, this art exhibit about AIDS in America had almost no Black representation, and so the Tacoma Action Collective, which is a group of young Black activists using direct action tactics, the kind that ACT UP used, die-ins, those kinds of occupations, targeted the exhibition and got it changed. So there's a way in which they we're taking aim at the way that the epidemic is narrated and remembered, using tactics from the movement itself in a way that I think is powerful, and kind of remixing those for the urgency of our current moment, and in the context of the movement for Black Lives. And I think they're now doing kind of mutual aid work, still in Tacoma, but doing mutual aid work and anti-police violence work there. So really kind of stitching together the urgencies of the moment in a way that I think is really powerful.
Yeah, and the second part of this question for me is the degree to which there's kind of now overlapping public health crises, right? So you've got
Right.
the AIDS crisis, and now we've got obviously the COVID pandemic on top of that. To what degree is, to the extent, again, that you can sort of understand it or reflect on it, to what degree is the COVID crisis kind of amplifying or deepening the AIDS crisis? And how are organizations responding? Are they sort of pushing these two public health emergencies together into one package now, or is it still sort of a separate thing?
I mean, I think the strongest connection that we see is just that, as with many public health crises, they affect the people who have the least resources, the least access to power, are those who are affected the most. And we saw that with HIV. We have seen that with HIV. We still see that with HIV, and we are seeing that now with COVID-19. So like anybody who kind of knew the history of HIV and AIDS in this country, like, should not have been surprised by what we've seen with COVID-19. I mean, looking at some of the places that are the biggest hotspots for both. I mean, we look at the prison system, and not just like prisons as spaces, but the system of mass incarceration as one that amplifies both of these epidemics. As is true. I think people have made some, kind of useful connections between the movement against HIV and the movement against COVID. One of the things that stands out is, well, a couple of things stand out. One is that, compared to where we are with HIV, we're so new in the COVID crisis, right? I mean, if you like layer these timelines on top of each other, from when we learned about AIDS to when we learned about COVID, we're in like August 1982. We're before any almost any of the groundswell of response happened. Obviously there are different crises. Like COVID has moved a lot faster and affected more people more quickly than HIV and AIDS did, at least in this country. But the other thing that I think is worth noting, and others have noted, like this is not my original point, is that a lot of the suffering and death from COVID has just happened out of sight, and that's in part a function of the distancing protocols, the control protocols. But it's not like with AIDS where fairly early on we had really gripping images of people who were dying, and I think in a way that really galvanized some of the public response. We haven't had that with COVID. We've actually had some effort to obscure the numbers, and to obscure the coverage of just what dying of COVID means, even as people are finding ways to like get around that, like the Faces of COVID Twitter account. I think we can kind of compare like the AIDS quilt and the Faces of COVID Twitter account is like they're trying to give a public representation to people who are otherwise dying out of sight in a way that hopefully galvanizes more of a public response to the crisis, at least in the way that we need a public response.
Yeah. Dan, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your work with the Polis Project community here in New York and beyond.
Thanks for having me. Really really glad to be here.
Yeah, and we've been discussing Daniel Royles' book, To Make the Wounded Whole, The African-American Struggle Against HIV/AIDS, recently published by the University of North Carolina Press. We encourage everybody to pick up a copy by going to UNC Press's website, which is linked on our Polis Project event page for Dan's talk today. Thank you again to Daniel Royles, and thank you to everybody that tuned in this afternoon for this important and timely and sobering conversation. We'll look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks for our next book salon. In the meantime, take good care, be safe, stay warm. Goodbye.